Hello and good evening. Welcome to everyone to the fourth Towards Anarchism virtual talk. Towards Anarchism is a series of events aiming at exploring and learning how anarchic processes affect inhabited space in its forms, dynamics, and organization. Today's talk, we plan to be the last one of the cycle, but there are actually some news, so stay here till the end to know more and or follow the pages. I'm Matteo Fontana, curator of this event, and I would like to thank the Student Senate of University U of Venice for the support in its realization. We are happy to have Franco Martín López as our guest for today's talk with the title Anarchism as a Decentralized Urban Planning. A short introduction for today's speaker. Franco Martín López is the research director of the Urban Observatory in Bases International Foundation. He has published several studies on urban issues from libertarian perspective. As an architect, he has delivered several conferences and published different articles on the topic of spontaneous urban planning in Latin America, Europe, and the United States. He has recently published his first libertarian-themed novel, The Last Frontier, a finalist in the Nadal Prize at Barcelona. Franco holds a diploma on Municipal Management and is currently writing the dissertation for his master's in Urban Economics and Specialization in Public Infrastructure Management. As usual, of course, I would like to invite you to interact with this live event starting from now already. You can write, in fact, your questions and considerations in the comment section, both on Facebook and YouTube, for a later discussion. And now, welcome, Franco. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Matteo. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My greetings to the UAV University of Venezia. I am really pleased to be here in this Towards Anarchism talk. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to try to be brief, around 45 minutes, no more than that. And after that, I will try to talk to you about any questions you have or any questions the audience have. So if you want, we can start with the presentation.
Yes, perfect. I leave you the stage.
Great. Well, the final name I put to this talk was City Planning and Markets, the importance of free market, polycentric, voluntary, spontaneous orders in urbanism. This is a complex name. We're going to try to understand where this name comes from. You already know, well, my name is Franco Martín López. I work at Fundación Internacional Bases. We are based in Argentina, but we have international activities because we also are based in different countries, mainly in European countries. And inside that, as Matteo told you, I run the Urban Observatory. I'm not going to explain more about me because we're going to try to make this talk about the topic of the talk. That is basically what we are going to try to start with is the problem of what a city is. What is a city? What is that makes a city special and different from other things? So, well, when we watch a city, what we usually see is diversity. We see a lot of people doing different things, and we see a kind of like a gathering of human activities, but we also see a kind of some degree of freedom and interaction, and we tend not to see specifically something that we could relate to maybe a fortress or maybe a human structure like a palace that is completely run from the top down and not from the bottom up. Also, we have this kind of images of cities, of these old cities that are usually the cities that attract us the most. And regarding this, there is an extremely good sentence, the phrase from Christopher Alexander, that is going to help us understand some of our problems later on the talk. That is that if we consider the last 2,000 years, almost all buildings have been built and designed by non-specialists. The most attractive places nowadays, often photographed by architects, were not designed by architects. So what he's trying to explain us is that mostly cities have been built by people in order to live their lives, to produce, to have economic activities, to have leisure, but they are not machines done for aesthetic principles or for example, imagine in a specific government purpose. So it's more kind of like in a spontaneous order. So specifically, how could we define what a city is? So first, in a city we find human and building diversity and density. Also, usually we tend to identify cities as the engine of civilization and of the economy. That is specifically true. I'm not going to give data about this because this is something that is well understood and accepted, but most of the current GDP is produced in cities, and most of cultural achievements and innovation are usually done in cities, inside cities. Also, cities have a material expression of our human relations. So it's not only these human things happening, but it's also the material infrastructure and structures that we create in order to live and to provide this kind of activities. So at the end, we can see that cities are an emerging phenomenon formed by free interaction of individuals. And these characteristics, that is not, maybe cities are not completely 100% that, but this is a specific differentiation principle that cities have to have in order to provide these kind of services and these kind of qualities that we tend to look in cities. But why? Well, first of all, cities provide services and goods always that the benefit, the welfare that we extract from these services and goods exceed the congestion costs of living in cities. Secondly, we have serendipity and human contact. So in city, we get together with other people, we get to know other people, we get to know about things. Usually it was harder to know about news and information and get educated if you were not in a city. Nowadays that has changed a little bit, but not completely. And on the third level, cities end up being a kind of like a construction of the contribution of free individuals. And that is something that we go to look for in the cities, because sometimes we need other people to help us provide something, to help us interact in order to gather and collectively solve some problems. This is specifically what differentiates cities from a castle, a military fort, a religious complex, in which you don't have a level of freedom that allows you for this richness and welfare to expand and create an innovation to happen. So there is a golden rule, in my opinion, of free innovation specifically applied for cities. That is that freedom leads you to innovation. Innovation allows you to have growth, and I mean not just in quantity levels, but also on quality levels, on life quality levels. And this is aided by technology. The problem is that when you use a specific technology and you gather this welfare, you also have costs, not only to produce this welfare and these goods and services, but also because these costs are an innate part of technology and production. And also beyond the transaction costs that you will have in order to make people coordinate the activities that you need. For example, you need an enterprise to coordinate economic activities, or a government to coordinate how are you going to rule security, or maybe how are you going to provide justice. But also beyond these costs and beyond this welfare that technology is going to provide, you are going to have congestion costs. Why you're going to have these costs? Because when you gather in a city, you have a problem that there is a lot of people in the same space and at the same time trying to not only use but also provide the same goods and services, and it's going to be harder to coordinate them because of the density of the city. How do you solve these problems, and how do you manage or mismanage this equation? Well, basically you use norms. Also you use property rights. You define them. It doesn't matter if you're talking about individual private property rights or maybe collective rights, but you have to define rights. You always do. And also you define governance units. What do I mean by governance units? I mean by limits and authorities that are going to rule some aspects of how this is going to work inside a place. And this is how cities are managed. Well, historically, cities have developed in this way, but as cities got more and more dense and as population grew through this process, we end up having a lot of congestion problems. And this is what you can see in places like, for example, Southeastern Asia and Latin America, in which you have a growth of population and of goods and services and of the application of technology that imposes congestion problems over the city that you need to start solving. So you need to change your technology, your organization, your norms, your jurisdictions, your property rights in order to rearrange the functioning of the city in order to allow that the costs do not exceed the benefits that the city are provided. Because if the costs exceeds the benefits, then people are going to start migrating outside of the city. And costs can be environmental costs, sound cost, economic cost, time cost, could be the cost of insecurity, it could be whatever you consider a cost, but it's going to start to expel people outside from one city to another, or from one city to a place that's going to start to become a city, or maybe to towns or whatever. So we need a conceptual framework for understanding exactly what cities, how cities work. Well, first you have the problem of the economies of scale. Well, in a city you will see that you will find infrastructure and services that will need these infrastructures that are basically physical structures that provide services that have economies of scale. What do I mean by that? That they have a minimum unit that is going to be needed to be provided in order to function technologically and also economically. So you, for example, you cannot put an electrical line and electrical equipment that brings electricity from 1,000 kilometers away only for one house. You need maybe a 500,000 inhabitant city, or maybe something like that, in order to allow you to technologically and economically provide the services. You have minimal units of functioning of the cities. Also, you have the problem of scalability. That means that cities are going to be arranged in a kind of like a fractal way, in which you have rooms that made houses, and houses that made buildings, buildings that made blocks, blocks that make neighborhoods, neighborhoods that make districts, districts that made cities, cities that made up metropolitan areas, and metropolitan areas create regions, and you can go on and on and on. The thing is that these kind of like scales, these limits, these kind of like units at different scales are usually the units that you want to coordinate with the size and with the units that you need in order to provide the infrastructural services that we talked previously. Also, you have the great dilemma of cities that we previously talked about, that we're going to summarize, that is that you have the accessibility scale, in which we know that cities provide an agglomeration benefit and a location benefit, in which when you get there, the sum of people will allow the scales to provide services, and also you will be in the place in which services are provided, and that is why you go to the city in order to access this welfare. But the thing is that this is going to this accessibility scale that we're going to see is going to define how do you manage land use, transportation, cost and mobility, housing and labor, and metropolitan governance. Why? Because it's going to balance congestion costs like traffic, pollution, real estate prices, insecurity, nuisance, etc., and the agglomeration benefits, productivity, exchange of ideas, higher salaries, accessibility of services. And this balance is going to structure how, for example, land is used. So if you get a lot of congestion cost in the center, downtown, the city, people are going to start to move to the periphery. So you're going to start using more land, and prices are going to change. And transport costs and mobility are going to be really related to this, because people are going to start seeing, well, do I want to live far away from the city and move to the center, or do I prefer to live in the center and work there? Or maybe I want to move my business and my factory away from the center into another place, so I don't have to bring people inside to work there, or maybe I don't have to bring my providers of, I don't know, materials or whatever. And this is going to affect housing and labor markets, and also is going to affect metropolitan governance. Why? Because when things start to move away from the center, they start to usually involve mobility between former jurisdictions that usually didn't connect. So when a city starts growing, you start having maybe a city beyond political borders, and this creates a lot of problems. Well, and finally, what are the economic assumptions that rule over cities? So we have this framework, so we can understand what are the central problems of managing cities. Well, we have things that are not perfectly met, like, for example, the definition of property and ownership of public things. They are not perfect competition, or even in some cases competition on utilities, and land is not something that you can easily produce and move, so there's not a really good market of competition between land, because different land location is not the same, so you don't have a perfect competitive land between different locations. You don't have homogeneity of goods in land. It's hard to internalize cost of externalities, and it's hard. You don't have easy free entry in the case of when you don't have free competition in utilities and land. But you do have some problems, like the dispersion of the knowledge you need for planning among people. You have prices. You have relatively rational agents working in the city. You have the tragedy of the commons that we're going to see, and you have public choice problems. Well, how all of this works in the city and what this means for the problems and the limits of planning and solving these issues in new urbanism. Well, we know that from the history, like from antiquity, we have a planning system from cities. We have this in Spanish colonies. We have this in Roman cities, but we're going to move forward, and we're going to go up to maybe one of the key moments of urban planning, that was the Renaissance. During the Renaissance, there was a Neoplatonist view in which there was a name for rational, let's say, design, not only of the new man, but also of the new city that was supposed to deal with this new expression of man. This started making big assumptions and big plans regarding the restructuring of cities, but it didn't take strength until the Industrial Revolution, when the Industrial Revolution created huge benefits and problems to solve. Why? Because the Industrial Revolution provided a huge movement of migration from the countryside to the city, increased quality of life and life expectancy, but created great visibility. It created a huge visibility of the problems that usually were hidden in the countryside for the intellectual elite. And the intellectuals started creating a kind of like a reproach of the Industrial Revolution and the industrial city, in kind of like an oligarchic attempt of solving the issues. This was not in parallel with data. Life expectancy was improving, but the environment, let's say the intellectual environment, started seeing cities as a nasty, brutish, maybe dirty place. So there were some answers to this problem during the 19th century. One was the garden cities. This was created by Ebenezer Howard. He was not the only one doing this, but basically what he was proposing was a kind of like arrangement of different cities around a central city, and an overlapping of agricultural and natural spaces between cities, and the distribution and differentiation of the uses of land uses in order to have housing, for example, and factories move apart from each other. How this ended up being built? Well, he had a private company solution. He thought of this being provided by private companies and not by the state, but this ended up manufacturing some classical English cities, and also it was maybe diluted into the shape that we usually associate with American suburbs. The other response to this was the more state-led response, like the renovation of Baron Haussmann in Paris. They completely destroyed the old city in order to create this kind of like new aesthetic planning in order to have views and new buildings and higher buildings, supposedly to provide infrastructure and have a hygienist excuse. Because the excuse they have for restructuring Paris was that it was an old industrial city built above and around a medieval city, and they needed to open streets, provide services, have better hygiene with not only sewage or, for example, more light for the buildings and more and better ventilation, etc. Also, they try to have an easier control over, for example, barricades in order to stop movements like the 1848 revolutions, so they can move easily armies inside the city. But this ended up being a complete failure. They couldn't control better the population with these arrangements. You have after the reforms in 1870, the Paris Commune, the revolution inside Paris, and the takeover of the city by some lower classes and middle classes. And also you have the problem of corruption around how they distributed land, and also how they distributed the streets and the benefits and the infrastructure among people, among owners of the land. All, of course, financed theoretically by the state. The counterexample of this was, for example, London. London was a more industrialized city than Paris. It used to be bigger, and it also was a medieval city that technically needed the same hygienist improvements that you will ask for Paris. But London was destroyed not once but twice, first by a big fire in 1666, and also then in the 20th century by the German bombing in 1941. And London is a city that was completely modernized without drastic changes. They didn't have to change land distribution, they didn't have to change land usage, they didn't have to build new roads. They always rebuilt the city as it has been rebuilt, because this has been built basically because the owners of the land didn't want to change their property rights and rearrange them. And we all know that London is a modernized city that has all the services that needs. So this shows how these attempts to restructure spontaneous old cities were not necessarily grounded in real arguments. The third wave of this started in the 1920s and was basically led by Le Corbusier and many other architects that started providing urbanism services or urban theoretical frameworks. I use always Le Corbusier showing his Wasson plan for the expansion for the rebuilding and the expansion of Paris, and his model of cities as an example. But there were many modernist architects that also wanted to do kind of like a blank slate for history and completely rebuild cities from top down with their arrangement and ideas. This phrase, I think, that summarizes exactly what they thought about urban planning. He said in 1927 in Towards an Architecture, a really interesting manifest, the city is an instrument of work, Multiply disorder is insulting. A house is a machine for living, and an office or factory is a machine for working. Architecture is organization. You, the architect, are an organizer. So what he's trying to say is that you have to think this in like a cold, supposedly rational way in which you are going to reorder the city in order to serve to some kind of like, let's say, greater good or greater objective. This translated into, you have the fascist, let's say, approach to city building in Soviet Russia. You have a little bit of that in Italy. It's Mussolini, in Mussolini's Italy. You have a little bit of that on Hitler's Germany, but you also have that without going to the extremes of those state-like cities. You also have that on state interventions in the West. You have, for example, this is an image of how they destroyed in order for rebuilding downtown Boston. You have this kind of city in order to provide this kind of city. This was thought as an improvement. You have like a consensus that this was not an improvement at all, and that this destroyed the spontaneity and the nature of the cities that we previously talked about as the core idea of what a city is. And until the 1950s, 1960s, you didn't have an opposition, a real true opposition to this kind of movement. In 1961, around 1960, Shane Jacobs, that is one of the women that's behind one of the signs at the right, was fighting Robert Moses. Robert Moses is the great New York planner that led and controlled most of urban planning and building in the city of New York for decades. She was trying to fight the destruction of parts of her neighborhood in New York in order to build a highway, and she was successful in actually like grassrooting action and stopping the plans. She was one of the few that could stop the power of Robert Moses. And after that, she writes The Death and Life of Great American Cities. That was Dalogag means there. She writes that and published that in 1961. And basically what she was trying to say was that there was an importance on the spontaneity of the streets of the cities, and how do you feel and what do you find spontaneously in cities. And you need that spontaneity in order to cities to work and to be safe. You needed people and activities and mixed activities in the streets in order to have eyes on the sidewalks and not only to have accessible services, but also security. And that this mixture provided innovation and sociability. And this was key for the functioning of a city. So basically what she was trying to say was that diversity and the possibility of change in the city done by people was what enabled progress and the usefulness of cities. So she talked a lot about the urban mixture, and she was against static zoning. That was one of the main rules of traditional urban planning, in which you will find that they will separate activities and they won't allow for housing and commerce to be done on the same place. So they started to rearrange how the spontaneous city was working. There was another author, maybe a little bit later, on the 1970s, with his book, The Uses of Disorder, that was Richard Sennett, that tried to explain also that cities provided this spontaneous conflict in which when you go to do your life, when you go basically to live your life, you will find conflict that you will have to try to resolve. And in this conflict situation appearance, this conflict that you were exposed to in the city and not in a hygienic, perfectly orderly city, it was in that process that you mature as a human being. He also put this idea that was completely compatible with Jane Jacobs' thoughts. The second important author was basically Christopher Alexander. He has, and you will see usually when you see a year, is because I am referring to the title of a book. But what he was trying to explain, and he was not talking much about cities, also about cities, but a lot about how do you construct buildings, was that you have always on the architectural side, but also on the urbanist side, a step-by-step process. And there was a lot of knowledge from the user and not from the expert, from the actual user that is going to use and live in the places. That was, let's say, transformed into a timeless way of building that evolved by trial and error through time. And this is a really similar thought to what Hayek understood as the evolution of social norms. What he said was, in this case, Christopher Alexander, was that there was an evolutionary process by trial and error that designed a way of building, not only buildings, but also cities, and that there was a lot of knowledge from the user embedded in this kind of process. And when you, from a top-down blank slate, completely new design, destroy this, you started to destroy a lot of useful ways of building cities. He thought that there was something that was called a pattern language that was basically exactly, let's say, like idiomatic constructions or like material sentences, in a way of saying, of relationship of things, of how things were specifically built. How do you build a window in this kind of weather? That was the expression of this timeless way of building that regulated space design, not only in buildings, but also in the cities. And also he had a theory about how this process was managing the structuring of a city. And he conceptualized the idea that the city is not a tree, and we are not talking about organic trees, but like hierarchical structural trees, the tree structures that you use in an organigram, for example, to explain how a company works. And what he was trying to say was that cities were a complex, non-hierarchically nested structures. What this means is that the complexity of relationship was not as simple as systems and urbanists and experts and designers can design and can handle. So you needed this spontaneous, free, emergent process created by people interacting in order to create a richer, more complex structure that ultimately forms cities. And this sum of small contributions was always in a constant change. So it was extremely hard for planners to actually be able to handle this problem. So between Jane Jacobs and Christopher Alexander, with a little bit of interventions of other authors, by the end of the 1970s, you already had a solid critique of the traditional way of, let's say, designing and planning cities. If we move to the 1920s, someone who has, I think, done a great job in this orientation is Sanford Aikida, that he summarized these concepts, specifically what he learned from Jane Jacobs, saying that if we understand that cities need these urban, spontaneous, free interactions in order to be cities, in order to work properly up to some point, you will see that the urban welfare returns, let's see the value of a city, if you wanted to put it in other words, is going to be dependent on this capacity. And the greater of the urban design detail and scope that you define from an urban planning perspective, usually the less that you're going to get from these urban welfare returns. But he explained that, well, there is up to some level, to some degree, a point in which the urban welfare returns increases as you design, put some level of order. For example, you hire an architect and an engineer to build your house and a building. And as a city, you decide, well, we are going to have streets here. We are going to have some level of uses. For example, we are not going to allow this kind of industry near these, like residential places. And this helps you create like urban welfare returns. But there is a point in which you exceed the level of detail that is healthy for a city, and this starts to decrease, and there is up to a point in which you have designed so much of a city, like in the Soviet style, in which you define the size and the shape of the exactly how you're going to design the kitchen, the house, the building, the block, the entire city, that you have no urban and free spontaneous interaction. So you start having almost no urban welfare returns and value. So up to a point in which you have designed everything, you have no urban spontaneous free interactions, and you have no urban welfare. You have these dead, completely Soviet style cities. This curve doesn't have to have exactly this shape, but it has this kind of like development in order for you to understand well why this happens. Well, the greater the scale of the design in which you move up, for example, you move from, well, I'm not designing the kitchen, but now I'm designing the building, or now I'm designing the entire region, the greater the complexity that you are dealing with, that you basically have. So in order for this to work, and you not to this, so you don't destroy the value of the city, and this is kind of like a summary of what Christopher Alexander thought of this structuring of cities. So you will have to try to reduce the level of detail of the design that you are going to define, the greater the scale you are dealing with. So if you're going to design a kitchen, you can design it completely. But if you're going to design, let's say, a region, you cannot design everything from a kitchen to the region. You will have to decide specifically which general aspects you're going to deal with in order to provide order and not move beyond those limits that destroy the complexity of the city that you need for a city to actually work. And usually what is going to happen is that at large scale designing, you will have to deal with massive infrastructure designing and not with every specific detail. So you will deal with, let's say, a more statistical approach to average, let's say, average commonalities of people's interactions, instead of dealing with every specific case and improbable situation. So in a nutshell, what we're trying to say is that the big attempt of control over city freedom will eventually destroy them, and central power has limits to the knowledge, to the dispersed knowledge among the individuals that actually create this emerging order that is needed for the city. When this eventually, let's say, condensed into ideas, it was summarized by the destruction of the Pride Igo public housing compound in St. Louis. That was first initially the kind of like a model of an example of urbanism, of modern architecture and urbanism, had so many problems, so many functioning problems, and so little compatibility with the society that was living in them, that eventually led to his destruction because of the problems that had for maintenance, insecurity, etc. This happened in the 1980s, and after this destruction, it is said that modern architecture was dead, and also that modern urbanism was dead. The problem is that the new, let's say, options or the new alternatives of the new urbanism usually deal with the same prejudices of the past. They will have also aesthetic design imposed over people. They will also have a lot of power delegated to town hall, and also the possibility that this creates in order to have corruption with special permits and people trying to, if they have money and power, use the city's power to, let's say, shape the city in their own interest. And also you will have the smart cities attempt to control every data and every problem that doesn't see the essence of the problem, because, as we have said, the nature of the city is on its very core the possibility of everyone doing their free activities and having their values and changing their minds and doing their basically performing their lives. And that is not data that you can gather and control, because as you gather and control it, it's not only almost impossible to do it perfectly, but also you destroy the freedom that you need in order for people to live productive lives that they enjoy, and that is exactly what they are trying to find and to reach in cities. So as a matter of summary of this impossibility, we can say that it is not a question of whether or not there should be planning, but rather whether planning should be carried out centrally by one authority for the entire economic system, or in this case for the entire city, or whether it should be divided among many individuals. So we can take maybe, let's say, Matteo, 15 more minutes to summarize this, and then we can go to the question and take a little bit of more time. Do you think so?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So the question now begins to turn into, okay, if there are limits to planning, and we understand that, what is the alternative to not planning something? Well, that is where the polycentric city and the emergent free market urbanism of spontaneous voluntary orders arise. Well, there is a fallacy that I usually refer to. That is the fallacy of the compact city, in which you take a city that has a continuity of public roads and infrastructures under a single public manager, and you suppose that when you suddenly, let's say, privatize that, or say to everybody, well, you can now do whatever you want here, and you stop managing that continuous unity, you will have your city or completely solved in a kind of like a libertarian fashion. And the problem is that the continuity of the physical continuity of infrastructures, and also the hyper subdivision of private property into small lots that are connected by that infrastructure of roads, energy, etc. When you impose, also when you have the unrestricted free use of the entire public space, that is usually what the state allows in public spaces, when you suddenly unleash that, and you don't provide a process in order to have a transition to other system, of course that the whole city is going to collapse, because you are basically not managing it. Because what you are going to have is what we usually call in economics a problem of incentives by the tragedy of the commons, in which you have undefined property rights that promote the wrong incentives in public spaces, because you have free access, use, and consumption without the exclusion of people. For example, in a road that ends up being degraded and has a lot of congestion problems because it's overused, because as you cannot exclude people from its use, you won't have any incentive for supply and maintenance of these services, but you will have a lot of incentives in order to use that. And that is what usually happens in a lot of places when you have this mismanagement of public spaces, in which you don't control, when you don't have prices and private incentives to control the access to these public goods. So problems arise. Why? Because you have public property and free riders, people that are not paying for what they use. So the benefits of these public goods, like for example the city or the park or whatever, are not internalized because no one can charge something for that. And also there is a lot of incentive to have negative externalities done and carried as costs to others. For example, if no one is controlling anything in the city, I can pollute, and that's a cost that I put it on you, and that is a cost that I'm not paying myself, because as I don't do what I had to do in order not to pollute you, I save money, for example, but I end up imposing costs over you. So at the end, what you have is you have no incentives to provide basically public goods and services on a voluntary basis. If you don't have the internalization of benefits, and you don't have and also if you have the externalization of costs, the system goes completely bankrupt. Why in this kind of environments markets can work well? Basically because, or you rather have a monopoly, or you left that monopoly unmanaged, so you don't have competition in any case, And also this encourages overuse and consumption of public goods when you cannot exclude someone from using things. And that is basically the tragedy of the common that was usually explained in the overuse of land by people who have cows and were grazing in public lands. As you don't have private property, no one had the incentives to maintain and take care of the property and not put their cows in the public lands, because if you don't do it, someone else was going to do it and you couldn't exclude them. So everybody had the incentives to overuse the land, and land was completely degraded by this process. When you have private property and you define private property, each one can control its own lot, its own land, so you can exclude other people, and you can, let's say, put the optimal amount of cows into production and use of the land, so you don't degrade it, but you get your economic welfare. That is the difference between the possibility of assigning property rights and the impossibility of doing that under the tragedy of the commons. Well, this tailor-made suit for the state of the preconceived, completely unified physical structures that we have in cities is a social and infrastructure challenge if you want to change it. It's not easy to change because it's already centralized. One thing is we talk about market options in new places and cities, and another thing is when you do that in already built and unified cities. So one option is to provide property and defined rights, rather privately or collectively. And you will say, well, how is a right defined collectively? Well, it is better to have a piece of land owned by sometimes the state than owned by absolutely anyone, if you have a conflict of for example, of limits between jurisdictions, because that is going to be even more mismanaged than being publicly owned. So if you can, you put private property, but if you can, you at least put some level of collective property. It could be the state's property, it could be a company's or an association's property. If you have goods that are hard to divide and define privately, what you try to do is you try to use quasi-rights, exchangeable quotas that you can change in a free market based on established minimums and maximums, like, for example, when you put fishing quotas. This is usually helpful for environmental goods that are usually related to the functioning of cities, like rivers, for example. And also you have to rearrange and define jurisdiction like in order to have your services provided correctly. Because sometimes if you have a city that has grown over the border and you are trying to provide, let's say, transport services, and you have to deal with two different, completely independent political systems, sometimes you're going to start to have, let's say, coordination problems between the different areas. And in other cases, you want to subdivide things in order to have a more close to the people approach and management. And in some cases, you will be able to privatize, to go to the privatization road, rather selling assets or by the provision of services and construction of things under state regulation by private corporations. But I think this should always be the last, let's say, mechanism, because it's an imperfect mechanism in which you have sometimes the worst of private incentives and the worst of state mismanagement being applied on top of each other. So I usually try to reserve that to the last resort. Well, what is not going to happen in an actual, let's say, new free market, non-state urban plan? Well, you won't have what I call the fallacy of the atomized city. That is basically this kind of like indivisible city that suddenly becomes a disjoint sum of all parts, in which you have common space and infrastructure that are left for inappropriate and unregulated use. This is not what you should suggest as the counter option to central planning. And for example, this I think there is a like silly, maybe immature libertarian idea, not because libertarianism is like that, but there are some libertarians that don't deal to this problem correctly. I think that, well, just you have to tell anyone you can do whatever you want inside your lot or your parcel, and this is going to work. And this is a problem, because if you build next to my house a 100-store building and the sewage is not prepared for that, we're going to have problems. So you have to solve the public goods problem. But the thing is that, well, first of all, public goods, and this is what is in the center, are not exactly public on an unlimited sense. They are public goods in a region, in a place. They are public goods limited to space. So first of all, but there's a great author, he says, well, public goods should be reinterpreted as territorial goods, in which they are public inside an extent. So if inside that extent, you have a private state, or maybe you have an associations or whatever, we're going to see this institution that manage these public goods, you can have competition not inside that structure, but between the structures. So if I provide any public good for this neighborhood, I cannot compete inside the neighborhood, because in here I have a minimal structure that I need to have a minimum scale problem for the provision of these goods. But I compete with the neighborhood and with whoever is providing that service in the neighborhood next to me. So people can move between them, and then the competition is provided in that sense, not inside the institution. Also, you can solve this problem through resolving transaction costs with new technologies. As we saw, technologies create new problems, but also creates new solutions. So, for example, if I have a lot of congestion problems, or I don't know how to provide, for example, transport, I can create technologies that allows me to work without moving from my house, for example. So this solves problems of transportation. Maybe I have a unified system of transportation with a subway that cannot compete with another subway next to each other, but is competing with the internet and people working from their homes. So sometimes the reduction of transactional cost of interaction, social interaction with technologies, allows you to solve these problems when you have problems of minimum scale for services. And also when you have holdouts, when you have a situation in which someone is not allowing you to use their property for something, for example, for building a road, sometimes you can solve that problem through territorial goods, in which you will have an authority that could be public or private, but an authority that's going to define, well, you have your property, but you cannot say no to the building of this road, for example. Or you can go through the alternatives, like, for example, having an alternative route or using other technology, or well, there are many options. So what are going to be the specific structures that we're going to see in order to close to this idea on this alternative approach? Well, you can have companies, and this is developed by Spencer McCallum, in which he's going to develop the idea of how a company can provide a city, and in which what they are going to do is they are going to build buildings, or they are going to provide services to a land or whatever, and they are going to rent that for the users. This has the benefit of being more competitive, because for people it's easier to change between houses when they rent than when they buy the house. And also, if you have one developer for the entire neighborhood or city or block, it is easier for the developer to say, well, I cancel all the contracts and I restructure and rebuild this place, and this used to be farmland, and now it's going to be residential land. It's easier because I don't have divided property. Another option is and also this has the possibility of having the free exit. Is when you don't like the thing, it's easy to go away to another thing that is competing with it. Also, you have the associations option developed by Robert Nelson, in which you have voluntary governance, in which you will have some kind of a structured democratic voice and vote within a neighborhood associations of owners. You will have a subdivision of property. Things are going to be more static, but you are going to have you have more control, let's say, of what happens inside, but you also stuck with it, because you have bought land and you have an agreement with the other owners of how you're going to manage this neighborhood. And you can see that inside a building, and you can see that inside a neighborhoods association of a neighborhood, of a residential neighborhood. The benefit of this is that you have formal voice. You can change the system. You don't have just a leasing contract with an owner in which you are only renting. And you have a third option developed by Elinor Ostrom that is more a cooperative option, in which you don't have exactly good property rights defined, but what you do is you have normal, if the community is small and homogeneous enough in order to have strong norms and values, you have already a system that works because it doesn't have to deal with a lot of complexity and diversity. This only works in small scales, I think, and she says the same. But this allows you to have informal action in order to solve the problems, instead of having these more formal structures of renting or property rights and owning in order to solve how you're going to deal with the public goods of an area. Always think of these structures like working inside a neighborhood or working inside a district or a city or whatever. Well, finally, you will have different shapes of cities if you want. You have the corporate city, in which, or maybe district or neighborhood, in which the functioning of the city and the management is centralized, but you voluntarily get inside the city. You rent or you buy something inside that voluntarily, and you, let's say, sign a contract into that centralized, privately managed space, place, neighborhood. Also, you will have this kind of like conglomerates in which you will have a sum of independent parts forming a whole, like a tangram, in which you will have different neighborhoods. Maybe one is managed by a corporation, maybe one is a neighborhood association. So, and the sum of these parts will eventually integrate into a city. And the other option is kind of like a miscellaneous, in which you will have a commonly state-run city that tries to provide the minimum that a state has to provide and liberalize the most it can, privatize the most it can, and decentralize as much as possible into smaller units. Usually the state-run options have a lot of problems, but current cities had to deal with this kind of like participation, decentralization, and metropolization approaches. And the conglomerates, let's say, ideas of private cities that can be homeowners associations, can be companies, etc., can resolve the problem of metropolization, of how they interact with each other. First of all, creating larger organizations. So, for example, you can have a neighborhood association that is going to provide public goods inside the neighborhood. But then the sum of neighborhood associations in the region will gather and create, let's say, a greater regional association that is going to provide public goods between them, like, for example, the big roads and highways that are going to connect them. And in this sense, I'm not going to deal a lot into this, but financial institutions are really helpful when they work without the intervention and help of the state, because they have really good incentives, for example, to not only serve as like meta big public goods regional providers, but also to finance big infrastructure projects like big roads and big electric infrastructure in order to coordinate and connect the different conglomerate units. There are also like everyday alternatives, like, for example, trying to have peak load pricing and paying for congestion, and having, for example, instead of taxis, you pay fees for using parts of the cities, and you get charged for parking, for example. That helps avoid the tragedy of the common in parking, for example, in public places. And also, there are a lot of other specific issues. But in order to close the presentation, there is a last, let's say, thing I would like to show you. That is that when we think about these ideas of the polycentric city with different associations and companies running them and providing public goods and solving the problems that we usually left to be solved by one big state that doesn't have the incentives to properly work, what we what we usually think is in ideals that sound unrealistic. But there are a lot of examples of real life that will show you that this is already happening. Nowadays, you have more people in the United States living in homeowners, private associations than in state-run neighborhoods. An example of this is more than 40,000 inhabitants, Sun City in Arizona, for example, full of completely private developed and run by homeowners associations. A shopping mall basically provides this for commerce inside a block. This is a completely private run system. Industrial parks that could be run by company or could be run by homeowners, like let's say in industries owners associations that are all around the world. A big building, usually if a building occupies even a block, is usually built by one corporation, and it's run rather or by a company that rents the space, or by a company that sells the offices or the houses, and then these people have to form a homeowners or a commerce owners association in order to run the public spaces and the public, let's say, goods inside the building. Sometimes slums work this way also. There's much more informality inside, but what you will see is that they tend to reorganize in a more Elinor Ostrom and cooperative way in order to define private property and the use and services inside the slum. Sometimes they have to gather in order to organize garbage collection when the state is not present. So this also happens when you don't need a lot of money in order to have these alternatives. You have historic examples like this kind of structures that were collective buildings created in China. They have hundreds and hundreds of years old, and they basically work like this kind of like Elinor Ostrom structures in which you have a cooperative property in an homogeneous small group that has normal values in order to establish how you are going to live together inside these, let's say, small cities. You have another examples, like for example, this is Westmoreland Place in St. Louis, but this was built by the developer Pitzman, and he built more than 50 streets that were basically private streets with houses and commerce on their sides that had basically public provision of goods. And when he built one street, he then built another one and connected them and provided the public goods, and then the homeowner associations of each small street coordinated with the other one in order to connect and provide the general public services, but they were completely privately owned and managed, not done by the state. And this was on the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, so it's not something new that is going on. And when you also have, of course, any kind of extremely old city example in which you have a completely spontaneous arrangement of people creating these spaces and how you're going to manage land. Not saying that this is probably not specifically efficient. You have very examples, as I explained, with the more associations or companies or cooperative structures in order to deal with how do you handle the management of neighborhoods and cities and blocks and regions. But this is a good example of how this has developed over centuries, and this is not a new idea. And just to end, so we can have some 15 minutes of questions, I provided these links to Mateo so he can post them on the video and on the comments, in which you can find some of the, let's say, essays that I used or that are the basis or the essays in which this presentation is based on. Some of them are in English, so some of them are in Spanish, and at the end you will find recommended materials that range from books to movies you can watch. With this I close the presentation. We can open up to some questions.
Yes, thank you, Franco. Yes, I will post all the references later on when the live is finished in the comments and in the description for the ones interested. You are not only really active academically, because of course you're pursuing like specialization and masters, but you're also like outside of the academic realm, like with the Basis Foundation and the Observatorio Urbano. How do you apply the principles? What we saw today, that it's really complex and full of layers. How do you apply it on your work in outside of the academic realm?
Well, in Bases Foundation, what we created was the Urban Observatory. That was, I mean, it's an attempt, it's a specific attempt because it's based on the city of Rosario, where we have our like original headquarters. Was an attempt to, let's say, privately from the civil society, make not necessarily new and create new information regarding the state of the city, but to gather, research, and collect all the information that we could in order to provide the, let's say, an analysis, kind of like a diagnosis of the city, and then transform that into a specific public policy recommendations. We also have, let's say, a scientific evidence approach. So what we tried to do was a summary of all the data available of the city, and then transform those data, of course, filtered by our, let's say, point of view, ideology, and ideas, and in that transformation, create these public policy recommendations for an actual city that already exists and that cannot go to a completely idealized system, but that can make a lot of improvements in a lot of specific, let's say, areas. No, I mean, you as I told you, you can move out to, you have a centralized city, you can decentralize some aspects of that. You have a public ownership of some things, you can privatize some of them. You can have more relaxed regulation in some aspects. You can regulate aspects that you're not regulated and are creating problems because they are not, for example, defining property rights over some, I don't know, public land that is completely mismanaged, etc. So we were trying to do that work that you can visit in our website. Is Observatorio Urbano. It's written in Spanish. .org, and when you enter that, you will find, you can go to our publications area, and you will find, of course, everything in Spanish, all of the diagnosis of the city, and at the end, on the working documents area, our public policy recommendations based on that diagnosis.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Also, because like as you said, it's really important, the topic of the feasibility, no, how to implement the models that you talked about in the real world that today faces a really different structure somehow. So it's also important not, as you said as well, not to oversimplify the vision and say, okay, let's destroy every regulation and let's privatize everything instinctively from the beginning. It can lead really to a collapse of what we have now, that is not for the good, but actually it ends with a clash in the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. I think there are two approaches to this. One is the incremental changes approach, in which you are going to say, well, I cannot change everything, so I'm going to try to focalize in specific points I can improve. So, for example, if you have a huge amount of public land owned by the state, you can sell that. And if you have a really strict regulation about specifically how do you build and every detail and everything, you can maybe relax that. But if you have a system, an electrical system that is completely unified and run by one state or private corporation, it's going to be really hard to change that into a competitive market. But you can maybe decentralize the management of some services, like, I don't know, like the cleaning services of the streets, to neighborhood units that could be run and financed by the people that owns property on the neighborhood, for example. So there are a lot of specific incremental options to transform the compact city that you have inherited from the past. And also you can maybe try to generate the legal framework for these new polycentric cities in places that are not built or that are currently in process of being incorporated into built land, and create a legal framework that allows for association of property owners, or for private corporations to provide and run and completely build new cities, or maybe for more cooperative approaches to some provision of public goods. But that is probably something that you will try to use as a solution for the provision of the public goods that the city needs, and the management of services, and the management of public services, and the limitation of private property in new, maybe like version-like spaces.
Also, because don't we talked in the second event about private cities, fully privatized cities. Don't you think that somehow, if they are too planned, too structured, then they repeat somehow the same errors that may occur on a central planning idea? Because of
Yes.
course it is maybe like with an increase of scale, as you were saying, also the complexity it's increasing.
I agree with that. I think that they are particularly exposed to that, specifically if they are big in size. The benefit of the system is that they are usually not that big, so it's going to be hard to find a private city the size of Buenos Aires, for example. The central city of Buenos Aires that is run by one state has 3 million inhabitants, so it's going to be hard to find a new private city that is run and owned completely on that size. So in that sense, it's a danger you're exposed to, but it's a risk, but I think you have to be really large in order to have that problem. Also, as they are not that large, you're going to usually find, or you should see, competition among these small or medium-sized private cities. And if you have this competition because you have free mobility between them of people that are, for example, renting places for commerce or for housing or whatever, the pressure of competition between these cities could help a little bit have guide the management of the city through the right path in order not to diverge into complete collapse. Also, you have the advantage that private cities, as they are private and voluntary, they carry their own costs. So they cannot tax you if you haven't signed a contract with them for that. So they always have like a limit that the state doesn't have, because the state can solve its bad management by increasing taxes, and the private city cannot do that. So they don't have that power. Usually people wouldn't sign into that kind of contracts. That will put like a limit and a good incentive for them to like properly manage the place. Also, there are many cases in which you see that private corporations that are managing usually big spaces like land, when they see that they cannot manage properly that, they tend to sell parts. So it's easy, or it's more easy for a private corporation to subdivide if they need, or to, for example, delegate management to another corporation if they see fit, that if they think that they're going to solve management issues. So I think they're exposed to that, but I think that they have pressure, or they have more pressure to work properly than the state. But if I have that in the presentation, but I didn't want to be so I didn't want to go for so long, for such a long time. But you have what is called the the ancient problem in firms, in companies, in which the greater the company, the greater the complexity of the problem you are trying to manage, and also the greater the distance between the owners and the managers and the employees. So the greater the difference of incentives that you have, because when you own something, you care that because you pay the cost and you gain the benefits. When you don't own that and you work for a salary, whether you are an employee or a manager, you are more prone to mismanage things because it's easier for you to, on the short term or in the medium term, cash your salary if the company, even if the company is not doing perfectly well. So you have this kind of like ancient problems inside the firm, but we don't have to forget that the reason why you create associations or companies is in order to simplify relationships and reduce social transactional costs that are basically the cost of making agreements, any kind of agreement. It could be inside a family, it could be in a corporation. So you create these organizations and you create responsibilities and rights inside them in order to simplify the problem and make it easier, and you create rules for society and your space to advance. So you have this like you always have this problem between the benefits of organizing things into organizations, institutions, could be private or publicly managed, and the cost of them getting too big.
Yes, absolutely. So also like compare like talking about the size issue, the scale, then we would almost expect to have more like a clusterization of elements, of neighborhoods, of like small cities, rather than totalitarian, let's say,
Exactly.
a whole central private authority, let's say. So then it would lead somehow to this confederation of cities, this like free network of autonomous entities. But I also noticed that in the presentation you use really often also these images of sprawl versus density. How do you see this applied to like, let's say, privatization or like decentralization? Because I know, for instance, that in another libertarian, semi-libertarian engineer, architect, planner is arguing that actually sprawl it's really state-driven rather than private.
Yeah, I do believe that.
So we would expect actually cities to become denser and denser rather than sprawl indistinctly.
Yeah,
Because
I agree with that. There are different issues on that question. First of all, is that we tend to think of private associations and neighborhoods on the periphery, but I think that is on a sprawl like style. But we forget that we have most of our cities are built out of buildings that are basically private owners associations on one lot. So we have like a confusion regarding that, because we have a lot of private associations downtown with a lot of density working. The problem is that as cities were like as you get closer to the center of a city, you usually get closer to older buildings. And older buildings and older areas of the cities were taken over by the state. So usually what you find is that when you move away from downtown, you usually move away from densities. This happens in every city. This is a problem of it's really with urban economics and mobility and price land, but it's a problem that is not related to necessarily being private or public. Is how do you organize your city that basically you want to be closer to the provision of services. But and as that happens, it's more land near downtown is more valuable. So what you want to do is you want to build more in the same place in order to get the most out of it. But beyond that, we have a lot of examples of private organizations working and providing services inside. But the problem is that as downtown usually are old, and they were taken over by the state, you cannot have the option of private organizations because they were already opt out by the state. But you could, in other like parallel history in which you didn't use state as a solution for public good services, you could have found this kind of private organizations creating public goods. And again, we find that in small buildings, we find that in shopping malls, we find this in industrial parks, we find this in the St. Louis City streets that were relatively close to downtown. So that is not a specific problem. But going to the other more specific side of the sprawl issue, I mean, sprawl was usually an American and North American United States issue. And that was basically, for a lot of historical reasons, promoted by the state because of financial incentives, because of regulatory incentives. It has a long history of how the state promoted sprawl. That is well documented, and nobody discusses that in the United States. Then now we have the modern discussion in Europe and in Asia and Latin America, and up to some level in some countries in Africa, of you see sprawl on these European and Latin American cities, usually done by private ownership of land, in which you subdivide them and you sell them as residential homes, and then you create homeowner associations. Well, that you have a lot of questions regarding if that is good or bad. Usually the thing is that you will say that you wouldn't like that to happen in order not to consume a lot of land and not to demand a lot of mobility, in order to have a low environmental impact. That being said, first of all, the consumption of land is extremely low. I mean, the whole urbanization of the world takes less than 3%, between 1.5% and 3% of the whole land. Of course, they like not counting water, rivers, Antarctica, ocean, etc. So it's not, we don't have a land supply problem. The problem could be specific in a place if you are building things I don't know, you're building above and using a natural resource that you would like to preserve or something like that. And on the second hand, you have the mobility issue that is usually fueled by the state. Why this is fueled by the state? Because what happens is that the state finances through general taxes roads that reduces the cost of living away from the center of the city, or living away from where you work. So maybe you're not moving to downtown, maybe you're moving to another parts of the periphery, but you're moving less costly than you would move if the state wouldn't pay for those roads, because you're not paying exactly for the building, maintenance, and usage of that road, but you would in a private system. Mm-hmm. The thing is that when the state does that, what you have is that they use general taxes and they dilute the cost of the roads among all the population that are not necessarily using that road. So for the user, it's cheaper than what it would have been if it was privately provided. So in that case, you have like an incentive to sprawl a little bit more than you would in other cases. But in any case, what you start seeing is that initially you have when downtown cities, usually run by state, start having problems, and usually these problems are product of the mismanagement of cities by state, you start pushing people away from the city into new cities. Those cities are built where they can be built outside the current city in the periphery. And at the beginning, they don't have economies of scale to provide services that you only will find downtown. But with time, they grow and they start having their own centers, and they start functioning and working as new cities in which people stop moving from in order to provide, to get welfare and services and goods. So they stop having the problem of mobility and of sprawling that you usually find in the literature. But this is a process that it takes a little bit of time, and as we said, it is incentivized by the state. That said, I would like to make a specific reminder about this subject. That is this: you have a tendency to let's say sprawl or to grow away from the center, because as the more you get to the more you get close to the center, you have less available land that is similar in order to compete between each other. What I'm trying to say, imagine that you have a city, and then you start to create larger and larger circles. The let's say homogeneous land that you have, I mean, the land that is up, that is in, I don't know, like 5 kilometers away, competes with all the land that is 5 kilometers away. But at 5 kilometers away, you have a greater perimeter, more land competing with each other than at 1 kilometer away. Because at 1 kilometer away from downtown,
It's smaller.
perimeter is smaller, so you have less land that is similar to each other, competing with each other. So even though when you move far away, it's costly for you to live because you are trying to get services from downtown, what happens also is that whoever is providing services that you will want, for example, houses, land, location, electricity, whatever, farther away from the city, is doing it with more competition of providers. So they have greater incentives to provide a better good than the person who is right in the middle, that has a monopoly over the provision of services, because that location is so close to the center that has that competes almost with no one, and that is also a factor that has incentives, because as farther away you move from downtown, the quality of the provided services in comparison gets better because you have more competition.
Okay, yes, you have like a wider range of services that you can use, basically, even though they are like scattered around a larger territory. Is this
Yes.
working also if it's
Yeah, I mean,
at the same time?
it's in each case you will see different geographical arrangements, so you will have the specificities that you wouldn't be, that they are harder to understand. But in general, like in theoretical terms, the further away you move from downtown, you have more competitive land. But also there is a point in which what you will see is that you are so far away from the city that you don't have scales and economies of scale for the infrastructure. So what happens is that you stop having incentives to live there. So you will reach like a specific point in which people will start moving away from the city, and then they will have to, like, they stop moving away at that distance, because that's extremely costly for them to live at that distance. So there is like an equilibrium point, and then that as that grows, moves a little bit further away, and you will start having like sub-centers, and you start having this kind of like a polycentric structure of cities, even with the state-run cities that you always see, in which it's like every big city has like sub-centers on the periphery, although it's built up to like moving to the center.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I think we are over an hour and a half, and
Yeah.
also my camera is like getting a bit crazy. So I think we can conclude. Thank you very much. Of course, I will put the references that you gave me in the chat and in the description. Also, I would like to say a couple of words, because this was supposed to be the last talk of the cycle, but actually, to cover such a wide topic as anarchism applied to urban space, yes, it's a good starting point for talks, but it aims to improve, basically, and to expand. The project basically it's extended, and also because there are other interesting people that we would like to invite in the future. Also, recently we got in touch with Student for Liberty, which is an international libertarian non-profit organization that shows interest in the project. So probably there will be some collaborations. So for the audience, I would like to invite you all to follow the page and to stay updated on future developments. Also, because we will end up to finish this cycle with a small digital and printed publication that we will distribute to everybody, to all the people that will like to have it. Thank you, Franco, again. It was really interesting, really rich, really a lot of knowledge and layers.
Well, thank you, Mateo. Thanks again to the university, to your University of Venice. Thank you for allowing me to be on this series of talks organized by Towards Anarchism. If anyone has a question, if you want to share my email or whatever, you can do that. That's no problem. Thanks again, and I'm happy that they're going to continue with more videos on these lectures.
Thank you very much again.
See you.
Thank you.